Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Furina Post-Release Analysis. Now, this is coming a little bit later than I wanted it to. I've been pretty addicted to RuneScape in the past few days. Sorry about that. But it is coming out. So as usual, for the post-release, we're gonna go through the pre-release video. But before we do that, I just want to talk very quickly about, one thing that I will talk about later on as well, but I think it's like probably the most important correction to the pre-release. And I know that not everyone watches the whole video or has time to watch the whole video, so I want to put it earlier than it actually shows up in the pre-release video. And it's how Furina works with Bennett specifically. Overall, my assessment of how she works with Bennett was pretty negative in the pre-release. I think I definitely underestimated Bennett as the only healer in her teams. And it really boils down to the fact that when you're using Bennett on an actual healing build, he can actually reach amounts of healing that are high enough that you can go from 50% HP to more than full HP. So if you go ER HP healing bonus, around 30k HP, now your healing bonus, for now let's take a look at Maidens. And then you also get some from Furina's healing bonus to the team. However, it is important to note that with Bennett, his first healing take will not have a lot of Fanfare stacks because you haven't generated your Fanfare from healing before you heal, obviously. So for now, let's take a look at like 100 Fanfare stacks. And it's 0.1% per at town level 10. Then if you have C5 plus Bennett and get his burst crowned, which is actually something that's fairly common. I think Bennett is one of the characters that's crowned the most often. Flat healing is 1587, motion value is 12.75, and you're healing for up to about 10k per tick. If you look at a random Furina team, right? Raiden, Bennett, Kazuha, Furina. If you're not scuffed like I am, with a bunch of HP percent subs on your pieces, my Raiden has 19.1k max HP, which means that when she's at half HP, all she needs is 9.5k to heal to full. What this means is that if you get a tick of healing from Bennett, as long as you weren't below 50% HP, which can happen obviously because it's your on-fielder, she can take damage, but it also won't happen. Like this is also a situation that happens fairly often. You're overhealing by 70, but that's enough to proc Furina's passive, right? Which gives you an additional amount of healing to the rest of your party. Basically, if you're playing characters that are not HP scalers and that don't have like insanely high base HP, then you can consider putting Bennett on a healing build. And even though his healing is single target, because he heals so much in one tick, you can actually get your overheal. And if you do, it significantly improves the healing that he does because he gets to proc Furina's passive. That doesn't inherently make this synergy like wow, insane broken, but it is something that alleviates Bennett's weakness with Furina, which is that his healing is only single target and doesn't heal above 70% HP. One thing that you'll have to be careful of though is if you're doing this, you can see my Kazuha here has over 20k HP because I have some HP substats. So you want to avoid HP substats like the plague. So that way your Bennett tick will be enough to heal over half of your character's HP, which is very funny. Anyways, let's get started. We can skip over the initial explanation of the kit because nothing changed. Actually, that's not true. Yeah, so the Usher attack's a little bit slower than this, but I guess it's not that big of a difference. Yeah, this is a team-wide buff as well, but it is not unconditional. Number one, you're not actually gonna have 300. It's more so gonna be more likely 200 to start with, ramping up to 300. So starting at about 45 up to about 70. Okay, I think that with Furina, there's something that a lot of people kind of don't realize, and it's that a pretty decent portion of the damage that your team is doing in a lot of teams happens before you get a lot of Fanfare stacks. I mean, Furina herself does damage with her E while you're doing your rotation through your characters, and she's not benefiting from the like huge Fanfare boost until you use your healer. And the reality is that when you're looking at a team, I think the team where I've felt this the most is the triple Hydro team with Yelan, Xingqiu. You have two options, right? Either you activate your Yelan burst and your Xingqiu burst before you do your burst on her, or you do it after. If you do it before, it means that, well, because of her burst animation and then Jean's burst animation, you're gonna lose out on some hits, right? Because you're gonna be in burst animation and it's gonna slow down your attacks. But if you do it after, then you're gonna get a decent amount of hits that don't have the buff. And because of that, I think that that specific portion of her kit, the damage percent, you're not actually starting at 45, right? You're starting at 0 and you'll get to 45 when you use your burst, but again, right, like that often happens a little bit later than your damage actually starts, which makes the average damage percent that you're getting a little bit lower than what I was portraying here, right? So like with this, in a team like this one, right, your average stacks are gonna be closer to 200 than the 250-ish I was expecting because of the animations, which is a pretty decent difference, right? It's like 12-ish percent damage percent of difference, and it is worth mentioning when talking about Furina teams. Anyways, let's keep going. The second obstacle is that her hydro application is slower. Teams that need to maintain a hydro aura, specifically a hydro aura, like Hutao Vape, won't really be able to use her as a single hydro unit. They will potentially be able to use her in double hydro teams, and we'll be talking about that. Okay, one thing that I didn't mention in the pre-release that I really noticed when I started testing her on live is that there is the side of her hydro application where it's like too slow to be enough for some teams, but there's also a downside in a different way, in that you can't stop it. It lasts for 30 seconds, which means your E is still going at the beginning of your next rotation. And that can make getting your swirl setups pretty scuffed, especially when you're playing teams like freeze teams against non-freezable enemies. And that does happen, right? Sometimes you play a freeze team and then one of the chambers has a non-freezable enemy. And when it does, Furina constantly applying hydro makes it a lot harder to get your cryo swirl. Now you can swap her arca alignment, but that means that you're losing damage and losing energy generation, which means her ER requirements shoot up quite a bit. Plus, you have to actually do the charge attack twice, which is even more time that you have to spend on her. All of this to say, the fact that like her hydro application lasts for a long time can also screw over some of your setups and make it so that they take longer to do because you have to manually go turn it off with your charge attack, and that's kind of rough. I'm not saying that Furina's going to do less damage than Yelan. That's going to depend a lot on which teams you end up using. Which means, if you want to be using her instead of Yelan, you need to be getting value out of the rest of her kit. You need to be getting value out of those buffs that she's giving to the team. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Like the point I'm driving at here is just, if all you're getting from Furina is her E, and you're not getting like a lot of Fanfare stacks, there's no real reason to put her in your teams over the other hydro options. She doesn't do anything that they don't. This is assuming you're doing a 20-second rotation. And while not that many, there are a few teams that have longer rotations. And maybe even more importantly, the average player doesn't do tight rotations with no time loss. The average player will do a 20-second rotation in like maybe 24, 25 seconds. And that slowdown, Yelan's damage if on a 25-second rotation is the same as on a 20-second rotation. But Furina's damage goes up by like 15 to 20%. It's not 25% because her burst buff expires, so her personal damage isn't as good while her burst isn't active anymore, but it is still damage and it is still useful. First off, we talk about Hyperbloom. Downside number one, your healer options for Hyperbloom tend to heal less. The most popular one is Kuki, and Kuki's healing is going to struggle a lot to keep up with Furina's HP drain. Okay, so addressing that, I stand by that. I think that's playing Hyperbloom teams with Kuki as your only form of healing is rough. However, there is a form of healing that is not a healer, and it is real, and it can hurt you. Prototype Amber on Nahida actually goes a long way towards helping you solve some of these problems. Is it enough to actually get the full value out of Furina? No, but it does alleviate it to some extent. However, there are some teams where you can run 2 Prototype Ambers, such as Neuvillette teams. And in those teams, you don't even need Kuki. I've actually liked the Neuvillette, Raiden, Nahida, Furina team. And if you don't have Raiden, you can very much use Kuki. I just prefer using Raiden because I don't have to stay close to the enemies. And the healing from Prototype Ambers, like both of the Prototype Ambers, plus Neuvillette's self-healing, healing him to full, and proccing Furina's passive from being healed to full, is actually enough enough to make it so that you don't, like, you offset the drain that you sustain, and you actually heal more than you take damage, which is very funny. So who is a good healer that can replace Kuki in those teams? Well, you can still use Kuki on top of another healer, obviously, right? Because a lot of people don't have Raiden, and Raiden tends to be the only other real off-field option for Hyperbloom. Kuki is still usable, but as an only healer, it's a little bit iffy. So who else can you use? You can use Dori, but Dori has a similar problem to Kuki, where her healing is a little bit better than Kuki's, but it's also only single target. It's only to the active character, which is also a pretty big issue. I don't think I actually ended up mentioning it here, but I am talking about non-on-field Dori. You can do C6 on-field Dori, and it is actually a pretty reasonable team with Furina. I haven't tested it because who the hell has a C6 Dori? But I've heard through the grapevine that it's an alright team, and I can definitely see it. But when you look at healers like Jean, especially, healers like Charlotte, which we're gonna very quickly cover as well, you get a lot of healing early on, but you don't get a lot of healing afterwards, which means that you'll be pretty fragile towards the end of your rotation. Yeah, I think that is very much a fair assessment. Obviously, there are some healers where that's not too much of a problem. I do talk about how it's only with certain healers, but with those healers, it really does feel, you really do feel a lot squishier. Hyperbloom is really going to be mostly for like when you're playing double Hydro, either with a double Hydro with something like Xingqiu or Yelan, in which case you would probably go for a Baizhu or Yao Yao as a healer, and then an Electro trigger. Or you can use something like Kokomi, and then have something like Nahida, Raiden, Kuki, and the Quick Balloon teams where she would be the only unit, the only Hydro unit, where you'll get her plus, again, generally Baizhu or Yao Yao, and then an additional either Dendro or Electro unit on top of your trigger. Okay, so when it comes to that, right, this specific core with Furina, Dendro character, Hyperbloom trigger, and then a last character, I think the one that's felt the best to play to me has been the Alhaitham teams. I think Alhaitham teams are the ones that tend to benefit the most from Furina in the team, because there is a pretty significant portion of your damage in Alhaitham teams that is coming from Alhaitham talent and quicken damage, which does get increased by Furina. On top of that, if you're using Baizhu, you get to also take advantage of Baiju's quicken damage increase. And yeah, it's felt quite nice. A thing that I don't actually end up mentioning here is also the possibility of going double Dendro support with an on-field Electro trigger. So something like Furina, Yao Yao or Baizhu, Nahida, and then Sino, Yai, Kuting, or even Raiden. I've been playing some cursed ass stuff with hybrid Raiden on 4-piece Gilded Dreams, where you actually do use your burst. I was going like EM, Electro, EM. I'm not sure what the actual optimal build is, but I think it's pretty close to that. And it's unironically a pretty good team, which I think is quite funny. But yeah, so that's another thing that you can do, and it works out pretty well. Next thing I want to talk about is Vape teams with all of the Pyro carries, right? The on-fielders. For most of the Pyro units, she doesn't actually apply enough Hydro. You're going to need more Hydro than what you have from her to be able to reliably vape things. It should be enough if you start on the right timing for a unit like Yoimiya and Dehya, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It's going to depend slightly on the timers. Okay, so with Dehya, it technically can be, but you also don't have a good way of setting up a Pyro Swirl without screwing over your aura, so I haven't liked it very much. It's still a playable team, but in most scenarios, you don't actually end up vaping Dehya's damage. You just end up playing effectively forward vape Furina, which is fine. She has special ICD. It's not standard. It's also not no ICD. The horse applies Hydro every other hit. The octopus applies every other hit. The crab applies every hit. Yeah, that was a slight editing mistake there. What I said is the right one. Not what's on screen. It is every hit for the crab. I don't really see it working out for Hu Tao. Probably not for Diluc. not for Yanfei, definitely not Klee. But that's the solo Hydro, you know. Okay, so here I'm talking about specifically trying to reverse vape your pyro carry. But I do want to mention, you can play effectively forward vape Furina, where you treat your team as basically a mono pyro team that just has Furina vaping some hits now and then. And that is actually a pretty good way to play her. And you in those teams, you can play her with these characters. Not a fan of it with Hu Tao, and Diluc is not great in general, so I don't know how to feel about that. But with Yanfei and Klee, it does work out fairly well. Oh yeah, and Lyney as well. With Lyney, technically works, but having played it in a few situations, I think it is probably the squishiest team I've ever played. It's a team where it's the easiest to just die. Now, obviously, you can say that's skill issue, and if that's something you're willing to play around and learn and all that, like, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's also a pretty important thing to know if you're planning on playing a team. You will die, and you will die a lot with that team. It's very squishy. And here I'm talking specifically about Lyney, Bennett, Xiangling, Furina, because if you have a defensive option, you won't apply enough pyro for Lyney to keep a good uptime on his passive. Furina does make you lose a little bit of uptime on Lyney's passive, but when you have Xiangling's pyro application makes it so that the time that you do lose isn't that bad, because Xiangling reapplies pyro fairly fast. You still get pretty good uptime on Lyney's passive, even if it's not 100%. But without her, if you're running someone like Zhongli or even Dehya, it's a lot slower. Bennett isn't really gonna work. Bennett does heal a lot. However, he only heals characters that are below 70%, and he only heals the current active party member. Which means, at best, you'll have to trade uptime on Bennett's buff in order to heal the rest of your team. And at worst, you're just not getting stacks because you're not healing the rest of your team. Well, that means if you use Bennett, you're gonna have to choose between getting Animo, which is a pretty, it's VV, it's a lot, or getting a healer. And there's no reason to play Furina if you don't have a healer. Yeah, so getting back to this, what I talked about at the very beginning of the video, which is that Bennett can actually be solo pyro in the right situation, or solo healer in the right situations. When you do that, then you can use an Animo or a defensive utility option in the last slot, and you can get away with that. However, you can also consider ditching Bennett altogether and going for something like this with Mika, or with Charlotte, or with... I don't know how I feel about this. I think it's kind of cope. I was high on Copium, I think, here. It works, but it's not great. There's going to be a lot of variety in terms of the sort of teams that you end up being able to do. And again, right, this is with the assumption that she is enough Hydro to let Yoimiya vape, which should be the case, but I am not. So technically, she does apply enough Hydro for you to get your vapes, but sometimes she doesn't. It depends on how the timers end up lining up, and as far as my testing has gone, on the first rotation, it seems to be fine, but on the second rotation, sometimes the Hydro app is like staggered in a different way. You actually end up with a Pyro Aura instead of a Hydro Aura. And then obviously, when you're in AoE, the summons can just hit the wrong target and you lose your Hydro. I don't really like this one anymore. I mean, I didn't like it that much in the pre-release, but I like it even less now. I think if you are gonna do Furina Yelan with Hu Tao, you really need a defensive option as the last slot. Otherwise, you just die. I don't hate it with like Jean as the last slot, but I honestly personally prefer it with Xingqiu because it makes it a lot harder to die. And again, you do end up pretty low HP with a team like this. Overall, it's all right. I haven't liked the Hu Tao Furina teams as much as the VV Vape teams that I usually play with Hu Tao, but the Hu Tao VV Vape teams are harder to play. Like the rotations are harder to set up, and if you f up, you lose a lot of damage. And I do f up pretty often. It's just what I do. I'm like, oh, well, whatever. It's fine. It is what it is. This is harder to f up, but it's still worth keeping in mind that like, it's a good team. Next up, let's talk about Furina in teams that aren't really focused on reactions. So, for example, you'll be able to do something like this, or this, With a triple hydro core with Yelan, Xingqiu, Furina, you'll be generating enough energy that basically all three of them will have fairly trivial ER requirements. That is true, and this is definitely one of the teams I've been liking quite a lot. It is a good team. Now, obviously, it does have some weaknesses. It's not the greatest in AoE, but the single target damage is so high that in most AoE situations, you can still brute force your way through them because you just have enough single target DPS to kill the enemies one at a time and still clear with a lot of time to spare. But that's not just mono hydro like this. You can also do something like this with a unit like Kazuha, or a unit like Zhongli, a unit like Venti. That is also pretty good. Although, personally, I've been preferring, for the Kokomi teams, I've been preferring the Taser variations over the mono hydro, right? Replacing Yelan with a character like Fischl, because it just feels so much nicer in AoE. And not just with this, like also mono hydro, like this one with Jean. This is one of the very few teams where we're replacing Xingqiu here. And I've been playing Yelan, Furina, Fischl, Jean, and I've been quite liking that team. And I think I've been liking it a bit more than the mono hydro version. I don't know about this. I think maybe I've changed my mind a little on this. So the reason why I like Yelan over Xingqiu if you're doing Furina, Hydro, Fischl, Jean is because the team doesn't really have a proper on-fielder, which means that with Yelan, you get to actually on-field her, get 2 E's per rotation, build basically 0 ER, maybe even Maréchaussée on her instead of Emblem. And when you do these things, right, then her damage does become quite a bit better than Xingqiu's damage, right? And that's why I've been liking it a lot. With Kokomi, you have a character that's an on-fielder, so I don't think that you gain as much from using Yelan over Xingqiu, but she's still very much usable in the situation in the slot. I think both Xingqiu and Yelan are pretty interchangeable, and you can also, yeah, like I said, right, just play a Taser with Furina, Kokomi, Kazuha, Fischl, which I've also quite liked. I think that's a pretty good team as well. Next up, let's talk about freeze. You can play Cryo Healer like Charlotte, who's coming out soon, or Mika, but yeah, you've got a few possible variations for freeze, all of which should be fairly decent. Yeah, so for this, I think it's pretty good when you are against freezable enemies, but she feels significantly worse in the other Hydro options when you're against bosses because of the way that her E interacts with your auras and makes it harder for you to get your swirl. We can talk about Taser, I guess, right? The traditional Taser core is this. If you're running Furina instead here, you'll have to get healing from something else. Maybe you can go for Sayu or Jean instead of... These options I don't like. I also don't like Kuki. Yeah, also not a huge fan of this. I think that Taser is definitely playable, but it is basically only in double Hydro Taser teams. So either Furina, Kokomi, and then like Fischl, Kazuha, or Furina, Fischl, Jean, and then either Yelan or Xingqiu as the last slot. I haven't liked her at all in double Electro, or I guess double Animo Taser teams, but I have quite liked her in the double Hydro ones. Next up, Nilou teams. And Nilou teams are interesting because they don't benefit from the damage bonus basically very much at all. However, her AoE is a bit bigger than a character like Yelan, and Nilou teams always run a healer anyways, so you're not forced to change your team to accommodate her, and you'll be able to max out your passive very early into your rotation, which means that she's actually just gonna be a fairly decent option in Nilou teams. I think that's pretty fair. She's a decent option in Nilou teams. I don't think she's like the first unit I'd recommend, but she's fine. I think we've covered most of the archetypes that would generally want a Hydro unit in them. However, because her personal damage is pretty alright, and her buff is so big, you're also going to see her in teams that don't necessarily need a Hydro unit. So for example, Noelle teams. Noelle teams are actually going to get a huge buff from Furina's release. Yeah, Noelle is like probably the one single biggest winner from Furina's release. Not that she has the best Furina teams, but looking at how good she was before Furina versus how good she is with Furina, the gap between those two is massive. Going a little bit more into the Noelle teams, I think that I haven't liked the Noelle triple Hydro teams too much because it kind of just feels like a strict downgrade to using like Jean instead in the slot. I guess maybe if you don't have Jean, then it's fine, but maybe I'd even prefer Sayu. Yeah, or Kokomi, I guess, that's true. So I haven't really liked this specific one too much. However, I have actually quite liked the double or even triple Geo Noelle teams with Furina. Double Geo more than triple Triple Geo, because they actually do have an advantage over the Mono Hydro one, which is that they have much better AoE. Noelle's AoE is really big, and when you're focusing on her damage by getting Geo Resonance plus Goro's buff, for example, she actually does pretty reasonable damage, and the AoE of her damage is really, really big. So something like, for example, Noelle, Goro, Furina, Yelan, or Noelle, Goro, Furina, Xingqiu, or even to some extent Noelle, Goro, Furina, Albedo, but maybe a little bit less so. These teams have felt pretty good, especially in AoE situations, and I think they're pretty good teams. What about Yunjin? I've never been a huge fan of Yunjin with Noelle. Noelle's main strength has always lied in her ability to consolidate AoE damage against a lot of enemies very well. And Yunjin in AoE is not a great unit because you use up all of your stacks pretty quickly when there's a lot of enemies, right? You use up one stack per enemy per hit. So I feel like there's some amount of counter synergy between Yunjin and Noelle, right? Between what Yunjin does and what Noelle wants to do, what her identity is. It's not that it's bad, like it is definitely playable. It's a fine option, but it hasn't been one that I've liked too much. Another team is going to be Wanderer teams. So, the Wanderer teams, in a perfect world, they're actually pretty good, the Wanderer Furina teams. But I've tested them a little bit. I haven't tested them too much because honestly, it was just too cringe. Playing Wanderer without a shielder just tends to be a very unpleasant experience. There's some situations where it's fine because he does get a, like, quote-unquote free dash after he's done a few attacks. But sometimes you have to dash twice in a row, or you have to dash before you get your free dash. And when you do that, it feels so bad. And then if you get hit once, you lose so much. I think it's definitely a fine team, but it is very difficult to fit a proper interruption resistance character in Wanderer teams with Furina, and that makes it so that I'd only recommend it to like very, very dedicated Wanderer mains that want to be able to play all of his different teams. Then yeah, like this is one of the teams that you can play, and it's a very good team for sure. But if you're a little bit more on the casual side, or you just don't like playing teams where you get ragdolled around all the time, then that might not be the team for you. Although that is definitely something that could change with the release of future characters that offer some resistance to interruption and healing, right? Like if Diona's healing wasn't dog shit, for example, she'd actually be a pretty good fit for a team like this. Yeah, I guess you can also use Baizhu instead of Mika here. The main issue with that is that Mika is giving you a decent amount, right? When you look at the attack speed and the Cryo Ascension passive for Wanderer, that gives you like, what was it, 20% crit rate? Baizhu offers you none of that, so you do get the resistance to interruption, but when you're playing Baizhu instead of Mika, the team is a lot less competitive with his other teams that are using something like Bennett Toma, for example. Yeah, like if you don't get hit, it is a pretty good team. Ayato teams, kind of similar to Mono Hydro, gonna be pretty good. Lyney teams are I haven't actually tested any of the Ayato teams, so I guess I'm sorry, I can't give you some post-release feedback on it. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be alright though. It's just, it's fine. Other characters you can use Furina with are like Xiao, but with Xiao it's a little bit harder to do a team that makes sense because he doesn't benefit from the attack speed that Mika gives, and he already gets a lot of damage percent from his burst. Yeah, I think Xiao is one of the characters where you can like consider the Bennett thing, but I don't know if I like it too much. It's alright. Bennett's burst doesn't last an infinite amount of time, so if you're using Bennett to heal before you swap to Xiao, then your Bennett burst is gonna last an even shorter amount of time, and you're gonna not have it for that long for Xiao, which is, I mean, it's still alright, but it's fine. You can use it on a character like Raiden and Hyper teams, but Raiden and Hyper teams kind of already have set things that work well with it. I can definitely see something like this might be alright. You gain a lot of damage percent already on Raiden, so you're probably going to benefit a little bit less from Furina's buff, but this should still be a pretty good. Okay, I think there's a lot more Raiden options than I expected. I've actually liked Raiden Taser a lot more than I expected to. So Raiden, Jean, Furina, and then Xingqiu Yelan as the last slot. That is a team that feels a lot better than I expected it to, and it performs pretty well. I've liked Quick Bloom Raiden with Raiden, Furina, Double Dendro. That is also a team that felt pretty good with her. This team feels alright. It's not my favorite one because it feels like you're wasting a lot of your stuff. Like, you're not really benefiting from the Sunfire because Raiden's Electro app prevents you from really vaping Furina, and you can't build a lot of EM on Jean to benefit from the Sunfire triggering reactions because you kind of need to build a lot of healing on her. Replacing Jean with Kazuha, going for a like full healing Bennett build, I think feels a little bit better overall, but that's a team where you will be very, very vulnerable to stuff like Current Abyss 12-3 second half for Coplia, because you just take so much damage. Yeah, you can also do a certain mix of like healing Bennett and like EM Jean. That can work as well, but at that point I don't really see a reason to do that over just using Kazuha. Klee, I haven't mentioned much, but can be used in a double hydro reverse vape with her plus Xingqiu, or you can kind of just do quote-unquote monopyro Klee. Oh, I didn't actually remember that I mentioned this. Okay, it's good. It's good that I mentioned it then. Kazuha Klee, and then use her instead of Xiangling, and end up forward vaping her, or a decent part of her damage. I don't know if I see it being better than Xiangling. It's definitely a reasonable option. This is not a, like, with Xiangling, you don't really have any on-fielder, so using Klee isn't bad because you actually can afford to spend field time on her. So it's a pretty good team. HyperFridge is also gaining a new cryo healer next batch with Charlotte. And while I'm fairly disappointed with Charlotte overall, as a driver for a Hyperbloom team, she will be pretty alright. I think it's fine. HyperFridge with Charlotte is like okay. I don't know if I like it more than just HyperFridge with Baiju as your healer, but it's fine, it works. In some Burgeon teams, where you end up doing double Hydro with her, whatever Pyro trigger, and then a Dendro healer. Burgeon also works pretty well. It's an alright team. And this is actually going to be fairly interesting, because there definitely might be some setups where you can forward vape a decent amount of Furina's damage, while also still getting a decent amount of Burgeons. So a larger portion of her damage can react, so you benefit more from vaping, from keeping a burning aura, which is something that you're gonna see. Yeah, I'm a little bit less optimistic about Sauté with her than I was in the pre-release. It works, but it's not the best. Bain-Marie. Now, this is a new team archetype that I've slightly mentioned in the Grizzly pre-release. Okay, about Bain-Marie, I think you're getting a little bit less melts than I hoped you would, unfortunately, but it is still very much a good team. It ended up performing a little bit worse than I expected it to, but I expected it to be very good, and it turned out to be pretty good. It's definitely one of the teams you can go for if you have Grizzly. Yeah, it's also worth mentioning, you need to have good artifacts to make the team work, because your ER requirements on basically all of your characters are going to be very, very high, and you're going to need to be able to get enough ER on your artifacts. And the ER requirements are high enough that, like, if you don't have high ER substats, that might actually not be enough ER. So it's a team that only works once you have a lot of ER in your artifacts. I think all that's left is the Neuvillette teams now. She is going to be quite good with Neuvillette, and Neuvillette is actually one of, if not the only character, where you can really get away without a healer in the team. Because if you're using Prototype Amber on him, and, you know, you get that healing back to full with your charge attack, then from being overhealed, you can proc Furina's Ascension 1. One thing that I wanted to mention about this, usually, when I do my charge attack like this, I don't actually heal all the way up to full health. And that means I'm not proccing Furina's passive. However, Furina's burst increases incoming healing bonus, and this actually does apply to the self-healing from Neuvillette's balls, which means that you will actually generally heal enough from your self-healing to overheal and proc Furina's passive. Now, this isn't actually going to be enough to break even without a healer, but it will be enough to break even with a poor healer like Kuki. Yes. And it will also be enough to break even with a poor healer like a second Prototype Amber. If you're planning on doing that, you should know your second Prototype Amber doesn't actually need to be refined. The way that Prototype Amber refines work is it starts at 4% per tick and it gains 0.5% per refine. So at a baseline, it gives you 4 times 3, so 12% at R1, and at R5, it's 18%. Each refine gives you 1.5% more healing, whereas a second Prototype Amber gives you 12% more. So if you have an R3 and an R1, that's better than an R4 and not a second one. You can do Jean Fischl, Jean Zhongli, Kazuha Kuki if you want. So I want to talk about those teams. I expected them to be Neuvillette's best teams before Furina's release. And after having tested them, I've kind of changed my mind. They're not bad teams in any sense of the word, but they're also not as good as I expected them to. And it really boils down to the fact that Neuvillette can't really get full uptime on Furina's buffs because he kind of inherently wants to do 24-second rotations with 2Es. If you're not doing 2Es, well, A, your ear requirements shoot the up both on him and Furina, but also it kind of ends up getting like weird with your timers and shit. But if you do a 2E rotation and you get 4 charge attacks, you can't really get all 4 with Furina's buff. You're gonna get at most 3 with Furina's buff. And so, while it does definitely feel like one of his best teams, for sure, I expected it to be above the other options, and after playing it, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think it's a competitive option with his other good teams, but that's it. It's just competitive. It's not, like, insane. That being said, there is a caveat to that, which is that if you have his C1 and you get the additional stack, then obviously it will end up performing better. And if you're using Jean Zhongli, when you're against a Cryo, Electro, or Pyro enemy, and they deal damage to you of those elements, your characters will have an aura that is Cryo, Electro, or Pyro. And Jean's Burst applies Animo to your character, and that can swirl auras that you have obtained from enemies. Therefore, you can apply Electro or Pyro or Cryo to the enemies and trigger Electro Charge or Vape or Freeze, and therefore get your third Neuvillette stacks without having to run 4 different elements on your team, even while doing double Hydro, which makes it so that the team significantly overperforms when you are against enemies of those elements. So when you are against enemies that are Pyro, Electro, or Cryo, this team becomes a lot better. And these enemies are fairly common. It does, however, have the weakness of being basically only Hydro damage, like the Mono Hydro teams, which isn't something I mentioned earlier, but I guess I'm mentioning it now, which makes it so that when you're against enemies that are either Hydro immune or at least Hydro resistant, the teams do tend to feel a bit worse. Well, if the enemies are Hydro immune, it's going to feel a lot worse. Hell, you can even use characters like Diona, characters like Charlotte, like Mika. You've got options. Yeah. And those are likely going to be Neuvillette's best teams. Yeah, so again, right, in retrospect, specifically when you're against enemies where you can cheat out a third stack from his passive, I think it is probably his best team. When you're not, I don't actually like it as much as his other team options. In any case, as you can see, right, you have a lot of team options. A lot more than for most characters. And that's because, at the end of the day, she's a very good unit. Now, I do want to put enough clarifications here. I usually hold back on calling units very good, because most of the time, it's very easy to justify skipping a unit, because whenever it's a carry, you're only going to end up actually playing them when you want to play that specific carry. So if you don't actually really like them, they're pretty likely to just end up on the bench. With supports, they're a lot less likely to end up on the bench, like properly bench and not used at all, because they're going to work with a lot of different teams. I don't think she's as good as the actual best supports. Yeah, I think that I definitely stand by that. She definitely does have teams where she's a better alternative to characters like Xingqiu and Yelan. But I think when you look at it holistically, when you look at it overall, you take into account all the stuff outside of just straight up damage that you gain from Xingqiu, he still stands alone as the best unit in the game by far, in my opinion. But if you don't like him, which I know a lot of people don't like him, then Furina does give you some options for teams where you could replace Xingqiu with her. If you don't want to play him, then yeah. She does also have the upside compared to Xingqiu and Yelan that she doesn't need to work with normal and charge attacks. So she works with characters that don't do them. Which as of right now, I'd say isn't that big of a deal, but definitely could be an indicator that they're going to start designing more characters similar to Neuvillette and Lyney, and I guess Ganyu to some extent, that don't really want to weave normal attacks in their rotations. I could definitely see that being a thing. That would go a bit more towards her being pretty good side of the equation. I guess another thing I didn't mention here is that even when you can weave auto attacks in between your skills and bursts, a lot of people just don't. And if you don't, then you are losing some value out of Xingqiu or Yelan. So that's another way where she could have some upside over it. I like that she incentivizes healers and having units that give you a reason to heal, and not just that, but that differentiates between healers, where having more healing and having AoE healing is more valuable than just having enough healing to get by. It gives an additional layer of balance to healers that can be very interesting. However, I can also see the other side, which is that the fact that they're doing that means that they're probably not going much further than they have in terms of making enemies more aggressive, and there's a limit to how much they're willing to make you necessitate a healer through the content.
Honestly,
which I
might have changed my mind on this. If anything, I think there's a very real possibility that it means the exact opposite, and that Furina is really meant to be the sort of character that, like, you put in your team if you're willing to actually be risky, right? Like an actual risk-reward type unit, right? And yeah, part of that is because of how the Hydro Tulpa works. So that's the new Furina boss. And it's an aggressive motherfucker. It does a lot of damage. It's not that bad in Overworld, but when it's gonna have the Abyss attack and health multipliers, because I'm pretty sure it's gonna be in the next Abyss or something, boy, is it gonna hurt. If it's a boss that can kill you in Overworld, it's gonna kill you in Abyss. So this might be indicative that they are planning on releasing more bosses like this, more very aggressive bosses, where if you are playing Furina, you have the downside of being squishier, and it's really like, are you willing to accept that downside for the potential upsides that she provides? So I'm not as confident in that assessment as I was before. Constellation 1, love is a rebellious bird that none can tame. There's not much to say about Constellations. This, basically all of it was basically accurate. Constellations are good. My thoughts on them haven't really changed whatsoever. But let's just move to the next thing. We need to talk about her ER requirements. We're not gonna look at this whole thing. Just remember, ER requirements can change a lot depending on teams. There's gonna be some teams where 5 is best, some teams where it's not. I would actually put Key generally above Jade Cutter. The thing about Key is I'm not actually sure if you'll be able to properly get your Key. You get the thing, and it's not much of a problem. Her E does damage on the initial hit, and then the summons deal damage, but they don't attack exactly at the same time. So I'm not sure if there is going to be that 0.3 second delay between. There is. As long as you EQ, you'll get your stack before you get 2 stacks. Harbinger is a very, very niche weapon that will only be good when you don't need the ER and you're playing a healer that consistently full heals your whole team. Honestly, I've changed my mind on Festering. I don't think on Harbinger. I think it's not good enough. Even healers that consistently keep your team at full health, in your setup time, you spend a decent amount of time without this passive, and I just don't think it's worth it. Even with Kokomi, I haven't liked it much. It's more of a meme. I don't actually think I'm going to include it. Oh, okay, never mind. I had changed my mind already in the pre-release, so never mind. That was good. That was accurate. Sapwood Blade is going to be a fine option when your ER requirements aren't too high in teams that have a Dendro reaction, where like you don't get that much out of going Flev Sound. You don't. Wolfang. I don't think you should do Sapwood. And then finally you have Favonius. Honestly, my Furina is on Fav most of the time. Part of that is because I'm just a Fav lover, but and because I play a lot of teams where she's solo Hydro. But I definitely stand by like the idea that she mainly has 3.5 weapons, right? Her signature, Festering, and Fav, and then if you don't have Festering, then Fleuve Cendre instead, and then in some situations Key. So it's like 3 and 2 halves. I mean, Jade Cutter can be fine if you're really low ER, but I think in most situations it's still just not. Because in almost every situation you do need some ER, so it's kind of just better to go Festering if you have it. I mean, if you really, really have no ER requirements, then it is better. Artifact sets. This is just real good. Just use Golden Troop. No other real option. You should 100% stick to Golden Troop. Which makes the default artifact stats to go for HP, crit. However, ER, HP, crit. Yeah, maybe we could just skip to the end here. This is accurate. One thing, in some teams you do get a little bit less average Fanfare stacks, and in those teams, and it can be definitely fine to go Hydro over HP. I mean, even when you don't, Hydro isn't too far away from HP, so you can kind of just choose whichever one has better substats in most situations. But yeah, apart from that, like this is basically it. I guess also you can consider replacing one of your HP main stats with an EM main stat if you're playing her in a team where she's forward vaping. I mean, I don't think there's much to say about this. And then for the healers, Barbara, definitely usable, but not great. You can actually build enough ER on Barbara to actually burst every rotation with Furina's hydroparticle generation, but it's just not great. Bennett, right, a bit better than I expected it to be. Noelle, already talked about that. Jean already talked about that. Chi-Chi, honestly, like, it's fine, but it's just, there's no real reason to run Chi-Chi on your team over other units, because since she doesn't generate any energy, even when you're looking for a cryo, like, usually when you're looking for a healer of a specific element, it's either because they apply an element that you want, or because they generate particles of an element that you want. And because Chi-Chi's application is pretty bad, and she doesn't generate any particles, then she doesn't actually fix either of those issues. So there's never really a situation where Chi-Chi's, like, optimal, but she can function if you just want healing. Diana, not great, she just doesn't really heal enough. Sayu, fine. Kokomi, pretty good. Kuki, only really on Neuvillette teams, or like sometimes Kuki plus Prototype Amber Nahida is fine, but it's still not ideal. Dori at C6 can be good, but before C6, not great. Yao, a little bit worse than I expected it to be, because having to go Furina Burst into Yao means that you don't get as long of a duration on your Furina Burst for the rest of your team's damage, so it's not quite as nice, but it's still definitely alright. Mika, yep, definitely quite good. Baiju, quite good, and Charlotte, pretty good as well, although Charlotte isn't as that amazing. But yeah, so that basically does it, I think. Closing thoughts?
She's not going to really make any character a significant amount stronger, because maybe except Risley. Not even then, honestly. Like, she's not gonna make any, like, specific carry a significant amount stronger.
Okay, in my mind there, I was just thinking about, like, teams that were already good. Obviously, this is wrong, because some of the teams that were not great, like Noelle teams, got pretty big increases. It is true when it comes to teams that were already good, none of them got a particularly significant increase, but some of the teams that were not that great did get pretty nice increases.
What she is going to do, though, is take a lot of units that were phased out of the meta because they didn't really offer enough and bring them back in, right? Characters like Mika that just kind of suck because they don't really do much. Characters like Noelle are going to have a whole second lifespan thanks to Furina. And as much as I think it's not necessarily the best design, I do like the intent behind their design to reinvigorate some of the healers. I do like that. I think that's really nice.
I think that was very much successful. A lot of the healers feel a lot better to play now than they did before.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you guys in the next one.
That basically does it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do the YouTube stuff. But it does actually help a lot. And honestly, maybe even more so, leaving comments helps as well. So if you made it all the way to the end, I don't know, leave a comment telling me what is the Furina team that you have been enjoying the most. And I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.